Hello and welcome back to Infamous Indie. I'm your host, ThatDeadGirl, and if this is your first time joining me, basically what I do here is I sit down with you all and I share a true crime story from my home state of Indiana. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody who tuned in last week to watch the video I did about Stephen Judy and Terry Lee Chastain. Um, that was definitely a very interesting case to cover, and I actually found myself like really kind of wrapped up in it. I just wanted to know more. So again, thank you all for tuning in week after week to hang out with me. Like I always say, it's good to know that I'm not just talking to myself and my cats. Now, this week's story has come highly requested to me ever since I started Infamous Indie. Aside from being one of the most, I'd say, horrific crimes in Indiana history, I mean, it's also probably one of the most devastating cases I've ever heard. And with that being said, I did just want to let everybody know that this will most likely end up being a three-part series just because there's so much information to go through. There's just so much to cover. And as always, I try to really focus on being thorough in my storytelling. I've just been really doing a lot of research and things like that, and I have a lot to talk about. So I normally don't do disclaimers just because this is a true crime channel. And obviously, if you're here watching, you know that we're not here to talk about sunshine and daisies. But with the nature of this case, I am going to be kind of giving everybody a bit of a trigger warning before we do start, just because of how bad it's going to get. So, this is me telling you right now that we will be getting into some really heavy shit. There's really not a light way to put it. We're going to be talking about child abuse, sexual assault, torture, among other things. So, if you find that that's something that you can't handle or are uninterested in watching, then now would be the time to, turn this video off and watch something else. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3rd, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana. Sylvia was the third of five children born to carnival workers Lester and Betty Likens. Now, strangely enough, Sylvia was actually born between two sets of fraternal twins. So you had Daniel and Diana, who were 2 years older than Sylvia, and then you had Jenny and Benny, who I believe were just 1 year younger than Sylvia, making Sylvia the middle child, in between these two sets of twins. Sylvia Likens was described as being very confident, outgoing, polite, well mannered, and lively. Although Sylvia was very outgoing, she would never show her teeth when she smiled in pictures. And the reason behind that was that she had actually had her front tooth knocked out by one of her younger brothers while they were, roughhousing. Now, Sylvia was very fond of music, but she absolutely, positively loved and adored the Beatles. It said that Sylvia could often be found in her bedroom, dancing and singing along to the Beatles albums. I'm a huge Beatles fan myself, so I definitely, thought that was really cool that she loved the Beatles. As a teenager, Sylvia would occasionally earn money by babysitting, running errands, and performing ironing chores for friends and neighbors. Sylvia would often give part of her earnings to her mother Betty to help with bills or groceries, and then with the rest, she would take her younger sister and they would go roller skating. Now, Jenny Likens actually suffered from polio, which made one of her legs weaker than the other. As a result from her struggle with polio, Jenny actually had a noticeable limp and had to wear a metal brace on one of her legs. When the two girls would go skating, Sylvia would actually, hold Jenny's hand so that she could actually skate around on her unaffected foot. It said that Sylvia was very, very protective of her younger sister Jenny, and the two were basically inseparable. Sylvia's parents' relationship was a little unstable, to say the least. They would often fight, and they would do so in front of their children. And it's said that they basically had an on again, off again relationship going through long periods of time where they would not be together. And the cause of this was mostly due to Betty's legal and financial troubles. Sylvia's father, Lester Likens, was born in Lebanon, Indiana, and he actually only had an eighth grade education. In spite of only having an eighth grade education, Lester Likens still managed to work a series of odd jobs to help provide for his family. Lester had a laundry route. He worked in several factories. He even owned a small restaurant for a short period of time, although it wasn't really successful and would go on to close. But eventually, Lester would find his true calling, and he would end up traveling around with the carnival selling food from a concession stand. Betty would also sometimes join Lester on the road, and sometimes they would even take the two brothers, Daniel and Benny, along with them for the extra help. Now, as for the girls in the family, they were highly discouraged from going along out of concern for their safety and their education. Now, the eldest sister, Diana Likens, she had already married and began to start a family of her own, basically. So during times when the Likens family would be on the road with the carnival, Sylvia and Jenny would often stay at the homes of family members or, family friends while the rest of their family was away. In June of 1965, the Likens family had just recently settled on the east side of Indianapolis, and I believe I remember reading that they actually lived on Euclid. So if you're from Indiana and you're familiar with the east side, I'm sure you know around about where that is. Sylvia and Jenny attended Arsenal Technical High School, and they would often attend Sunday school at a church in their neighborhood. So at this point in time, everything seems to be going pretty well for the Likens family. I mean, obviously, they have some issues, as all families do, but for the most part, the Likens family seems really happy. That happiness would all start to change around July 3rd, 1965, when Betty Likens is actually arrested and subsequently jailed for shoplifting. So basically, Betty's in jail. Lester's on the road with the carnival. This left Sylvia and Jenny to fend for themselves, basically. Lester actually comes home to an empty house, and he's completely unaware of the situation with Betty at this point. So Lester's basically like, what the hell's going on? Where's my wife? Where are my daughters? He's completely clueless. So he comes back outside and he happens to see his next door neighbor. And at that point, the next door neighbor actually informs him that he had seen Sylvia and Jenny walking down the street with some friends from school. So he points Lester Likens in the direction of a house that he had seen, Sylvia and Jenny go into. Now, this house belonged to a seemingly trustworthy woman by the name of Gertrude Baniszewski. So Lester finds himself at Gertrude's house, and at this point in time, Gertrude goes on to tell Lester that Betty has been arrested. And Lester is a little bit irritated at this point. He's like, oh God, not again. As I mentioned before, Betty often had a lot of legal troubles and had been arrested. So this was not the first time that this had happened. So Lester's at a loss. He's completely frustrated. And I'm sure Gertrude could see this. So she actually goes on to offer Lester um, a little bit of help, basically. So she tells Lester it's totally fine if the girls, Sylvia and Jenny, stay the night at my house while you go figure out what's going on with your wife. So this woman, her home, her children, all seemed very normal to Lester at this point. And because Sylvia and Jenny had gone to school with her daughters and had gotten along well with them, he felt that it would be okay to leave them there overnight, while he went to go deal with Betty and her situation. So at this point in the story, I'm going to take a little time out to talk about Gertrude Baniszewski. She is one of the main characters in the story, and I did want to try and give everybody just a little bit of background on her. Gertrude Nadine Van Fossen was born on September 19th, 1928 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Now, Gertrude was the third of six children, and it's said that her family was considered to be working class, and they were also of Dutch descent. When Gertrude was just 11 years old, she would actually witness her father die from a heart attack. And other than this, very little is actually known about Gertrude's childhood. About 6 years after her father had his heart attack, she would actually go on to drop out of high school. She would go on to marry 18-year-old John Baniszewski at the age of 16, and they would go on to have 4 children together. Although John had a very volatile temper and would often beat Gertrude, the two would remain married for about 10 years before their first divorce. And yes, you heard that correctly. I did say first divorce. Following Gertrude's divorce from John Baniszewski, she would go on to marry a man named Edward Guthrie. Now, this particular marriage would only last about 3 months before the two would actually end up getting divorced. Now, shortly after that, Gertrude would actually end up remarrying her first husband, John Baniszewski. They would go on to have 2 more children before ultimately divorcing in 1963. So, needless to say, little Miss Gertie here, she got around. Following her second divorce from John Baniszewski, Gertrude would go on to date a man named Dennis Lee Wright, who was only 22 years old at the time. So in 1963, that would have made Gertrude about 12 years older than Dennis, actually. Sadly, Dennis was also very physically abusive towards Gertrude, but the two would actually end up having a child together. But as soon as Dennis Lee Wright Jr. was born, Dennis Sr., basically just ghosted Gertrude. From there, Gertrude would go on to file a paternity suit against Dennis, basically just trying to get him to pay child support for their child. It's said that Dennis seldom contributed to the care of their child, but he could sometimes be seen at Gertrude's house. He would kind of just drop in for a quickie or basically to just bum money off of Gertrude. So by 1965, Gertrude Baniszewski basically just lived alone with her 7 children. So forgive me, it's kind of hard to just memorize all their names, but I am going to tell you their names because they will also become a more important part of this story later on. So there's 17-year-old Paula, 15-year-old Stephanie, 12-year-old John, 11-year-old Marie, 10-year-old Shirley, 8-year-old James, and of course, 1-year-old Dennis Jr. Now, Gertrude was a tiny woman. I think she was about 5 foot tall, and she weighed under 100 pounds. Gertrude was often described as being rail thin, haggard, and depressed looking. At the time, she was only in her 30s, but it said that she looked about 20 years older than what she actually was. She was also severely asthmatic, but she was also a very heavy chain smoker. Gertrude Baniszewski was actually diagnosed as clinically depressed. Now, this was probably due to the stress of 3 failed marriages and a recent miscarriage, which had actually been Gertrude's 6th miscarriage. Which, wow, that's just insane to me. You already have 7 kids and you've had 6 miscarriages. Yikes. Now, I'm not, an expert, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that taking care of 7 children all by yourself has got to be very stressful. I think that in itself would take its toll on anyone's mental health. So clearly, little Miss Gertie here is on the struggle bus. She's basically just depending on these sporadic checks that she sometimes gets from her first husband, John. Gertrude would also perform, a series of odd jobs like cleaning, sewing, or ironing for friends and neighbors just to try to make ends meet. Gertrude resided at 3850 East New York Street, and in 1965, Gertrude's rent was about $55 a month. Now today, people will be freaking the fuck out if their rent was that low, but back then that probably was pretty expensive, especially for a single mother of 7 children who had no real job or career path. So now we're going to kind of get back into the actual story. I did just want to take a few minutes to give a little bit of that background on Gertrude. As I said, she's pretty much a central character in this story, so it is important to know um, where she's at this point in our story. So at this point, Betty Likens is in jail. Lester Likens has made some sort of arrangement with Gertrude Baniszewski so that Sylvia and Jenny can stay overnight with her while he goes and figures out what's going on with Betty. So Sylvia and Jenny stay overnight at the Baniszewski residence, and it's all pretty normal. Basically, it was just like a sleepover for the girls. And the next day, when Lester returned for Sylvia and Jenny, everything was absolutely fine. Sylvia and Jenny had actually become really fast friends with Gertrude's two oldest daughters, Paula and Stephanie. The girls all attended tech high school together, and they'd actually begun hanging out a lot together after school. And it said that they were just typical teenage girls, singing, dancing, playing games, and gossiping about boys. So Lester Likens actually is propositioned to go on a traveling carnival tour at this point. And in Lester's mind, he absolutely cannot pass up this opportunity financially. They're struggling, they really need the money, so he really has no choice but to go on this tour. And since the girls were getting along so well, Lester thought it was a good idea to strike up a deal with Gertrude so that the girls could board at the Baniszewski house while he went on this traveling carnival tour. Now, obviously, Betty would end up joining him on said tour later on, as at this point she's still in jail. So Lester and Gertrude come to an agreement, and basically Lester would pay Gertrude $20 a week so that Sylvia and Jenny could board with her in her home while he and Betty were out on this carnival tour. The tour was set to finish in the fall, and at that point, Lester and Betty would return for Sylvia and Jenny. Now, I do want to say that I've seen some conflicting statements in regards to this, but I've heard some people say that Lester Likens never went inside the Baniszewski residence, and then I've heard other people say that he went inside the house, but he really didn't look around or pay too much attention to anything. Had Lester actually taken the time to go inside the Baniszewski house, he would have seen that there weren't even enough bedrooms, let alone beds, for all of these children to sleep in. And basically, there would be 5 kids sleeping on one mattress that was just laying in the floor. The Baniszewskis didn't even have a stove. Instead, they just had a hot plate. And it said that they actually only had about 3 spoons and a couple of dishes, so they would all actually have to take turns eating. Basically, the Baniszewskis are living in complete squalor, and Gertrude is in no way, shape, or form capable of taking in any extra children at this point in time. Honestly, she's doing a pretty shitty job of taking care of the 7 children that she already has. So obviously Gertrude goes along with this agreement. She's desperately in need of the extra money, and she promises Lester that she would care for his daughters as if they were her own children. So shortly after the July 4th holiday, Sylvia and Jenny would move into the Baniszewski residence. Their parents had traveled to the East Coast, to start the carnival tour, and they were set to return for the girls sometime in November. Little did Lester Likens know that he was basically condemning his daughters to a house of horrors. In the initial weeks of caring for Sylvia and Jenny, Gertrude actually did keep her word. The sisters weren't subjected to any, abuse or punishment during this time. The girls were all getting along great. Sylvia and Jenny even helped them all out with their household chores, and they would all attend church together every Sunday. So basically, at this point, everything's nice, everything's normal. But sadly, that would all come to a very abrupt end. So as I said, Gertrude and Lester had an agreement where he would pay $20 a week for Sylvia and Jenny to stay with her. Now, the first payment he actually gave to her in advance. But after about 2 weeks, the payments had actually failed to consistently arrive on time. Sometimes coming 1 or 2 days late, and then sometimes the payments wouldn't even come at all. And I don't know why, the payments would be late or why he wouldn't send them, but shame on you, Lester Likens. So as you can imagine, Gertrude Baniszewski is pretty pissed off, when the payments aren't arriving. She's already got these 7 kids, and now she has 2 extra mouths to feed, and she has absolutely no income and no way of caring for these children. And it was at this point in time that Gertrude actually began to take out her frustrations on Sylvia and Jenny. She drugged Sylvia and Jenny into her kitchen and had them put their hands down on the table and lean forward. From there, she would lift up their shirts and begin to strike them with a belt, screaming, "I just took care of you little bitches for 2 weeks for fucking nothing." And it said that she, beat them roughly about 15 times each. And as Gertrude beat Sylvia and Jenny, her other children stood around and watched. So obviously Sylvia and Jenny are, very hurt, very embarrassed, and I'm sure they didn't really understand the entirety of what was going on. So Sylvia wanted to basically cheer Jenny up just to try to make her kind of feel like things were okay. So she actually began scouring the neighborhood for empty Coke bottles. So back in the day, you could take in these glass bottles and they would give you money in return for recycling them. So basically, her plan was to recycle these bottles to get up a little bit of money so that she and Jenny could go to the candy store. And she just wanted to make her sister feel better and more at ease. So they arrive back at the Baniszewski house. They've just gone to the candy store. They've come back with candy. And they come home to find Gertrude sitting there. And the first thing that she actually says is, "Your father didn't send the check again." So Gertrude's pissed off already as soon as they walk in the door. They haven't even done anything wrong. And she happens to see that, Sylvia and Jenny have all this candy. Gertrude absolutely just flips the fuck out on Sylvia and Jenny. She's screaming at them. Where did you get the money for that? You're a thief. I know you're stealing from me. And the whole time, Sylvia is just trying to explain to her, no, I recycled these bottles. I earned the money myself. I would never steal anything from you. Gertrude just wasn't buying Sylvia's story for whatever reason. And this time, she would actually end up beating Sylvia and Jenny with a fraternity style wooden paddle. And just like the first time, she actually beat Sylvia and Jenny in front of her children as they all watched and did nothing. Um, she would actually pull down their pants and beat them numerous times on their bare buttocks. So basically, these incidents would happen where Gertrude would basically lose her shit and she would take out her frustrations on Sylvia and Jenny, and then time would pass and things would go back to normal. Just a few weeks after the paddling incident, the Likens sisters attended a church dinner with the Baniszewski family at the church that they all attended in their neighborhood. Now, as I said, there's not even a stove in the Baniszewski house. I mean, I'm assuming there's probably little to no food. So they go to this church dinner, and obviously Sylvia and Jenny are just, devouring this food. Gertrude's oldest daughter, Paula, happens to notice this, and she tells her mom, "Wow, did you see them? Did you see the way they ate all of that food? People are going to think, that they're not being fed or they're not being taken care of." When the Likens sisters returned to the Baniszewski house after the church dinner, Gertrude would proceed to beat them yet again with this wooden fraternity-style paddle. And these are just the first few acts of abuse that were administered by Gertrude Baniszewski. And by the beginning of August, Gertrude had actually begun to focus all of her rage and abuse on Sylvia exclusively. So I actually feel like this is a pretty good stopping point for the first video. As I said, this will be a 3-part series just because there's so much to cover, and I feel like we've barely kind of chipped away at that with what we've talked about today. So with that being said, thank you for tuning in. As always, if you like what I'm doing here at Infamous Indie, feel free to like and subscribe and definitely share my content. I will have part 2 of the Sylvia Likens story up sometime around Sunday, probably late Sunday evening. That's usually the only free day I have to myself on weekends to film and edit and all that stuff. So thank you guys for hanging out with me today. And as always, stay spooky, keep it creepy, and watch your back because it's a crazy fucking world out there.